imagine more. Keep on dreaming, no time to sleep. You know the rough nights override the good. Let me help you try to get out the hood and imagine more.
On the streets, everyone can tell the same story. Standing on the block each day, waiting for glory. All the young soldiers and all the young men doing the same things over and over again. Bailing out of schools and bailing out of jails. Selling drugs, getting high, cops on our tails. Knowing one day it's all bound to fail.
Every time I look at you, I imagine all that you could be. Through the storm we'll walk with you, even if we have to cross the sea. Reach up high into the sky and forget about the ones that hurt your heart. Imagine a brand new start.
Right. I'm not the only boy without a father.
I'm not the only girl who's been abused. I'm not the only one to rob and hurt someone, and not the only one who's been accused. I'm not the only one whose mother's angry. I'm not the only one to lose a friend. I'm not the only one to cut and hurt myself, and not the only one to hope my friends. Outside of you, there is possibility. Inside there could be a plan. You could be the one to build the village. You'll need help, look around and see who can. Build a village, build a village, build a village so every child can dream. Build a village, build a village, build a village. But no, it takes a team. See all the other youth who are just like you, though they seem to be enemies, not friends. When you think that they only want to strike you, imagine that the opposite's with them. Imagine stillness is the art of flying, not to run away, escape or get high. It's the aha moment of knowing who you are. That is what it means to fly.
I imagine having my own art gallery in the city of Chicago.
Imagine
I imagine being the best father I could be.
imagine more.
I imagine me going to the Air Force.
Imagine more. Imagine more, imagine more, imagine more. Build a village, build a village, build a village so everyone can soar. Build a village, build a village. We know what it means to fly, and every reason why. And we won't stand alone anymore. No, we won't stand alone anymore.
Thank you so much to the incredible artists for adding their gift of music to start our important journey together today. Again, I'm Mary Sue Barrett, President of the Metropolitan Planning Council, or MPC.
And I'm Todd Brown, Chairman of the Board of the Metropolitan Planning Council.
So 2.5 years ago, the Metropolitan Planning Council and the Urban Institute began a journey with the generous support of the MacArthur Foundation and the Chicago Community Trust. We set out to answer two questions. First, what exactly does it cost the metropolitan Chicago region to live so separately by race and income? And then, with that answer in hand, the second is, what do we do about it?
We realized that in order to address the interlocking issues embedded and caused by the segregation, causing the segregation and inequity we face in Chicago, that we had to go beyond our traditional focus areas: housing, transportation, and land use. We recognized the need to set a broad table, one that included listening to and working with leaders in public safety, public health, and education. In the end, our staff worked with more than 100 advisors and working group members with expertise in housing, transportation, land use, education, public safety, and public health.
And certainly that's a lot of you in the room. So in March 2017, MPC and the Urban Institute released what was called the Cost of Segregation. It documented the extreme price all of us in this region pay for living so separately by race and by class. Our study revealed a compelling truth that as residents of the metropolitan Chicago region, our future is intertwined and interdependent, that we all pay a steep cost. It can be measured in lost income, lost lives, and lost potential. Specifically, we found that if the Chicago region dropped to just the median of segregation, we would see $4.4 billion more in African American income. We would see 30% fewer homicides. We would see 83,000 more bachelor's degrees.
But if we continue at our current pace, we wouldn't get to that median until 2070. And we realized that that was totally unacceptable.
So both before and since the release about a year ago of those findings, we've been working hard with many, many of you in this room. And our job is to forge a roadmap for moving us forward as a region. You'll hear in just a minute from the lead force behind all of this, our Vice President, Marisa Novara, and our colleague, Alden Lowry, Director of Research and Evaluation, about this roadmap and about the roles that all of us can and need to play to create a more equitable and inclusive metropolitan Chicago region. When we say that everyone has a role to play, we really mean it. We mean everyone. And we put ourselves and our 84-year history right in the middle of that journey as an organization.
MPC is doing its own work to become the most equitable organization it can be. We are on that journey, and we know that the more we hold ourselves accountable internally, the more powerful the work will be that we do with our communities, with our government, and with our businesses. MPC needs to model the future that we're fighting for. We've done a lot during the last couple of years to try to make sure that our board, our staff represent the communities that we serve and are invested in. And we look to do more as we go forward.
We recognize that each of us, including MPC, have a part to play in executing on that roadmap. And to hear more about this journey that every institution is on, as individuals, companies, and organizations, to create a more equitable and inclusive region, we're just delighted to have Brant Ahrens here from CIBC. CIBC is one of those major institutions in the metropolitan Chicago region that has been leading the way. And we could not have done today's event and the video that you're about to see without the help of our partners at CIBC and Brant. Welcome.
Thank you, Mary Sue. I'm thrilled to be here today with a lot of my CIBC colleagues as we come together to work on the issues around equity and inclusion. We've been longtime supporters of MPC, and we chose to sponsor the video today called Our Equitable Future because we really believe that we need to improve our neighborhoods, stop the violence, and give people opportunities. As a bank, what we've chosen to do is really focus on entrepreneurship and how do we give those that are trying to make new companies come to life in our neighborhoods, give them that opportunity. Two areas where we've done that, I think, particularly well, and you'll see one of the examples in the video, is we take very small loans for new companies. We take risks that others aren't willing to take so that those companies can thrive. Another place, and this goes back a couple years, it's actually a program that I announced with President Preckwinkle a couple years back, where we are doing rehab for homes in many neighborhoods. It's that one home on the block that just can't get, you can't make it better unless you actually support somebody like a young developer that can come in and rehab that home. And over the last 3 years, we've put $5 million to work. That means we've lent $5 million, and we've created more than 40 homes in those neighborhoods. So with that, I'd like to introduce the video in just 1 second. But in order for us to get closer to these communities, in order for us to do better in these communities, one of the things that CIBC has chosen to do is we're opening a branch here in Bronzeville. We're opening a branch here in Bronzeville. As you know, in today's banking environment, not a lot of folks are opening branches, they're closing branches. But we feel we need to be closer to this community in order for our people to do the good work that we're doing today. So that branch will open in the next 18 months, I believe, and it's a brand new development around 33rd and King, 39th and King. Anyway, with that, I'll introduce the video. We're thrilled to be on the journey with you all. Thank you.
Chicago has a wealth of talent and ability and resources, and there are people who are segregated, who do not feel a part of society. The Metropolitan Planning Council's report provides us with a pathway through education, through job opportunities.
We needed to give students at Harold Washington the access to the same high-paying career track jobs that graduates of four-year colleges have. It is not a charity. This is not something run by the foundation. This is a talent strategy.
It's a launching pad for our students to ensure that every child in our city looks to downtown and says, I can and will be a part of this.
Last year, there were 50 apprentice slots in Chicago. This year, in 2018, there's over 150. And next year, we're on track for over 400.
For years, Oak Park has been an incredibly progressive and inclusive community. We were one of the first communities in the country to embrace fair housing laws. Oak Park was one of the first communities to adopt a same-sex registry, and we think this is just the next step to trying to make sure that people have a voice within government and within the village. You know, racial equity is such a broad concept, but I think ultimately it's going to be an issue of having a way for everyone to be included, not only in the decision making, but in the decision outcomes.
What makes this country a wonderful place is that we have made lots and lots and lots of changes. Once the change is made, people will embrace it. And so I'm very optimistic.
I grew up on the west side of Chicago. It's not too diverse. You see like drug dealers where I'm from and like gangbangers. I didn't want to fall victim to the streets myself.
We clean streets, but it's much more than that. We are ambassadors for the community. When people are blocking and tackling the challenges of poverty, they're oftentimes blocking and tackling all kinds of other stuff. Whatever their challenges, there are lots of them. And so it's not just about the job, it's about the whole person.
I talked to my mom yesterday. She said she's proud of me. Before this, I had nothing.
And we hope that it becomes transformational, not just for the people that we serve, but for the communities where they have the honor to make a little bit brighter for everyone.
The New Home for Chicago program, developed in the early 90s, it was an attempt to create affordable housing for working families. But it also was to make sure that vacant lots would be replaced with something that was a tangible asset. Providing them with the education, how to buy a home, how to sustain their home. Many of the families have been able to build wealth because they were able to use the equity to be able to continue providing for their family. Pilsen is on a path of development. We want to encourage more families to stay. We want to encourage more families to buy. We want to make sure that people who have been here for many years can benefit from the prosperity that is taking place in the community.
We cook food from the heart. that just brings a cozy, warm environment here to the south side of Chicago.
The restaurant is beautiful. I believe it changed this neighborhood. It's a staple in the community. It's gonna attract more businesses to come into the community.
We were roughly making about $300 to $400 a day. Making payroll was a strain. CIBC came through for us and definitely helped us financially.
It's rewarding to be able to see businesses grow and people's lives change.
So to see an African-American entrepreneurship on the rise like never before is one of the best things that ever happened to Chicago. The reinvestment in the communities, we can invest in each other.
My name is Marisa Novara, and I'm a vice president at the Metropolitan Planning Council.
And I'm Alden Lowry, Director of Research and Evaluation.
Thanks again to CIBC and to everyone who shared their stories in our video about all the ways that they're working to make this a more equitable and inclusive region. More stories are told in the roadmap that you have on your seat and more online at metroplanning.org/roadmap. This morning, Alden and I will tell you how we got to today, what we've learned and the vision we have for how we can all work together to create a more equitable and inclusive region.
Here's the how. We've worked with more than 100 advisors, working groups. We've had one-on-one conversations, focus groups. We've had surveys, and we also had 2 learning trips, one to Seattle and another to Atlanta. We divided up the region into 5 community typologies in our study of how things are working and where things are going. And we also did long-form interviews, testing out policy ideas on the ground against political and fiscal realities.
MPC's March 2017 Cost of Segregation study explicitly emphasized the enormous price we pay for segregation. But while we've quantified the negatives of segregation, we also know that integration will not solve every problem. Because segregation is fundamentally a byproduct of racism, our solutions focus on racial equity and inclusion. This is the only way to disrupt Chicago's legacy of segregation. So what's our roadmap? 1, changing the systems that create and perpetuate disparities through racial equity. And 2, implementing policies and programs that will make a difference right now. Racial equity and policy change. There's multiple examples in the roadmap, and we'll run through a few. First and foremost, we believe government, the private sector, philanthropy, and nonprofits should adopt a racial equity framework. This work paints a clear picture of how budgets, laws, hiring structures may be perpetuating inequities by race, by location, and by income, regardless of intent. From there, we can shift the conditions that are holding a problem in place. This is systems change through a racial equity framework. And this is change that people in this room are doing. President Preckwinkle is here from Cook County. Commissioner Morita is here from the Chicago Department of Public Health. Matias Valenzuela is here from King County, Washington. Angelique Power from the Field Foundation, many more. You'll hear more from them this morning with more detail on how they're getting this work done. And as you heard from our president and our board chair, MPC is holding ourselves accountable to this work as well.
On the policy front, while there are 24 recommendations in the roadmap, we will give you 4 examples. Number 1, adopt a city-earned income tax credit for working households. The result would be $218 million in additional spending towards our regional economy and the ability for working families to build wealth and to save. Thanks to the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability and the Center for Economic Progress for their partnership on that recommendation. Number 2, eliminate the use of cash bail, which disproportionately and negatively impacts young men of color. We could save nearly $200 million a year by eliminating unnecessary pretrial detention, and most importantly, we would stop punishing people for being poor by removing people from their jobs, their families, and their communities, quite simply because they don't have the money to make bail. and this is for crimes and offenses of which they haven't been convicted. Many thanks to the Chicago Appleseed Fund for Justice and the Coalition to End Money Bond for their leadership on this issue.
Number 3, increase options for people with housing choice vouchers. A 33% increase in allowable rents would give access to over 3,300 more housing units than voucher holders have access to today. I'll give you one example from a neighborhood nearby. Under the current allowable rents, there are 0 2-bedroom units eligible for a housing choice voucher in the near South Side community area. If this change were enacted, 47% of 2-bedroom apartments would be eligible. We think housing choice vouchers should actually enable choice. And we thank the Policy Research Collaborative at Roosevelt University for their work in partnership on this recommendation. And finally, city aldermen should no longer be able to reject or indefinitely delay a proposed residential development with affordable units if his or her ward has less than 10% affordable housing. It is a basic notion that all communities need to contribute to the city's affordable housing needs. And if that's our basic principle, then individual communities should not be able to opt out. If we're serious about being an equitable city, then aldermanic prerogative cannot be sacred. Again, these are just a few examples. There's much more detail on how these changes would work and impacts and case studies on our website. And I should emphasize, these recommendations are not exhaustive. We need many more good ideas and many more implementers. This is a start.
We also worked with Rolf Pendal at the Urban Institute to look ahead with population projections to 2030. These projections highlight uneven growth and rising income inequality. Here are 2 examples of our projections to 2030. First, households earning below $30,000 and households earning above $125,000 will continue to grow, and they'll grow in different places. The growth of those earning less than $30,000 will happen primarily in the suburbs, or will be highest in the suburbs, I should say, and the growth of those earning more than $125,000 will be highest in the city. Second, without major policy shifts, the African American population in the city will continue to decline, such that by 2030, African American population in Chicago will reach its lowest level since the 1950s. An additional loss of almost 140,000 African Americans is expected according to these projections. That's equivalent to losing the entire city of Naperville by 2030. And if that's not a call to action, I don't know what is.
Finally, in the spirit of full inclusion, we acknowledge that in this work we've told the story of African Americans, Latinos, and whites in this region. But we recognize that discussing people of color in a simple binary of African Americans and Latinos is incomplete.
Our field struggles with insufficient data to tell complete stories of the Asian American and Native American experience in this region. And as a field, we've got to do better on data and better at capturing the experiences and contributions of all groups of people. It should be noted that Asian Americans are the fastest growing demographic in the Chicago region, and one in which we should give much more attention to.
We also acknowledge that where we stand today is the traditional homeland of the Ho-Chunk and other Native Americans who've lived in the Chicago area for over 10,000 years and continue to today. And we name colonialism and the removal of indigenous people as some of the earliest acts of segregation and discrimination in this country. So in conclusion, we have laid out 2 paths to Chicago's roadmap: racial equity and policy change. What we need now is the political will and the commitment to implement. The good news is that all of us in this room are implementers. If you are one of the 110 people who worked with us over the past 2.5 years to make this roadmap as strong and inclusive as possible, would you please stand and be recognized? We are very grateful to you. When we started this work in November 2015, as Mary Sue said, we had two questions. What does it cost us to live so separately by race and income, and what are we going to do about it? And we did not know the answers to those questions. And through a really authentic process of inquiry, through listening to critique and listening to each other, we've been able to arrive to today. I can't thank you enough. And if you're part of MPC staff or consultants or research assistants, most of you are already standing, so if you can just raise your hand. This is the most incredible team of dedicated and talented people that I've ever worked with, and I'm really grateful that we've been able to bring this project to today. I'm also so grateful that Rolf Pendel could be here today from the Urban Institute. Rolf, could you let us know where you are? Okay, thank you so much. When we came to Rolf and Erica, his colleague Erica Pothig at Urban Institute, that was in 2014, and we truly didn't know what we were getting into at that point, and they helped us set out a roadmap to figure out an answer to our questions. So I couldn't be more grateful for your assistance. So more to come. Up next is Ryan Blocker from Enrich Chicago. Enrich Chicago is a cohort of 20 arts and philanthropic organizations that are committed to racial equity in the arts. We did a joint program with Enrich Chicago back in March, for which Ryan created this exercise that he's about to do with you all. And we found it to be a profoundly moving experience and a deeply personal one. And so we're really honored when Ryan accepted our invitation to join us today. Please join me in welcoming Ryan Blocker from Enrich Chicago.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I forgot this was going to be filmed, so I'm glad I had the accidental wisdom of wearing vertical stripes. So this is our second time working with Metropolitan Planning Council on this second phase of their study. And the study examines the financial and economic impacts of racism. But there's a surprising kind of poeticism in the matter-of-fact title. What truly is the cost of racism and segregation? Who pays? What do we get in exchange for that payment? And in response to these questions, I was drawn to the image of a receipt. And by asking people to document on a receipt, it illuminates some of the often mundane ways that segregation shows up in our lives. And I was also interested as an African American in the historical significance of the receipt. My family history is recorded in receipt books and bills of sale. And then there's also, how many of you are familiar with the slang expression, keeping receipts? You know what it means? Okay, so just for a literacy moment for folks who may not know. Let us say that you are in a work meeting and someone says something that is different from what they said in the email, and you still have that email? That is a receipt. So it's this idea about keeping people accountable. And so in keeping receipts, we remember our past, we document our present, and we keep hope with us, the hope for returns or reparations. And so you all will have a copy of the receipt that I made in your booklet, and I encourage you to think about that and reflect on that. But what I'm going to invite you all to do, and also our panelists to do, is to reflect on the cost of segregation in your life. Perhaps the cost of segregation is an expensive Uber from the South Side because ride-sharing services are scarce. Perhaps it's 4 new school closings. Perhaps it's being followed around in a bookstore. And I think very often we're very comfortable with understanding the cost of racism, what it means for people of color, but I also want us to reflect on what that means for those of us who are white as well. Perhaps it means a lack of connection to our neighbors, which manifests as anxiety when they do things like sleep in a dorm room, sit in a Starbucks, or grill at a park. One of the things that, for me, I've done this receipt as well a few times, and some of the things that I've gotten, or some of the things that I've mentioned, sometimes there's actually a financial cost for racism, and sometimes it's a personal, emotional one. And to complicate the narratives of how we often think about how segregation functions, one of the things that segregation got me was a high-quality education. Because I grew up in Columbia, South Carolina, moved to Lexington, South Carolina when I was in the 4th grade, and by moving 20 minutes down the road, I now speak conversational French, I play the violin, and I've gotten to travel all over the world because I moved 20 minutes down the road to the school district that held the resources. What did it cost me? Was a sense of connection, a sense of belonging. And so I'd like for you all to take a moment to reflect on that receipt for yourselves as well, and I'm going to invite the panelists to do it, and I look forward to hearing what bubbles up for folks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ryan, for sharing your receipt and for sparking personal reflection. And we'll hear more of that from some of our panelists. So up next, we have our first panel. One of our main messages today is that we all have a role to play. And we're eager to show you, not just tell you, what we mean by that. So our first panel is made up of leaders in government, both locally and nationally, and moderated by Grace Ho, president of Woods Fund Chicago. We will first hear remarks from Cook County President Tony Preckwinkle and Commissioner Julie Morita of the Chicago Department of Public Health and the work they're implementing here in the Chicago region. One update I have to make to our program is that unfortunately our speaker from New York City's Department of Public Health, Dr. Aletha Maybank, was stymied by the weather last night and again this morning. And despite her heroic efforts, she was not able to get a flight. So we know some things about her experience that Grace will still share with us on the panel, but we'll spend most of our outside of Chicago learning focused on Matias Valenzuela. President Preckwinkle.
Good morning. So I want to go off script a little bit here at the beginning. First of all, I want to thank the Metropolitan Planning Council for doing this work. I often say in my speeches that I live in a profoundly racist country. Profoundly racist country. But that's not the kind of acknowledgement that's often made by either our elected officials or our corporate leaders or our community leaders. And of course, it's at the core of a lot of the challenges that we face. I usually say race is the subtext of all of our urban issues, whether we're talking about police conduct and accountability, or education, or opportunity. The subtext is always race. So good morning and thank you for being here today. I applaud the commitment to confronting the continued prevalence of prejudice, racism, and segregation in our society. This is an important and necessary conversation. So we're in Bronzeville. Bronzeville was the artistic, political, commercial, and social epicenter of Black Chicago. And while much has changed in this community, the problems of segregation and inequality endure. A century after the Great Migration, we find ourselves trying to repair the financial and social fractures created by restrictive covenants, redlining, white flight, and systemic racism. Misguided public policies and a lack of political courage to confront and talk about racism and segregation have only exacerbated this problem. A quick sidebar here. We talked about aldermanic privilege. I was alderman for 19 years, and I don't remember when exactly this happened, but at one point there was an effort to provide affordable housing in a 6-flat in one of the wards on the northwest side through Section 8 vouchers. And there was a community meeting at which a large number of people came and all opposed to this one 6-flat in the community having voucher holders, and the alderman of the ward led the opposition. The alderman of the ward led the opposition. Unfortunately, we're at a point in our national history where racism and sexism and anti-immigrant sentiment is promulgated by the President of the United States. That's quite a challenge. Undoing 400 years of inequality is a problematic task, yet this heavy lift does not absolve us of our moral obligation to confront this issue at every turn. In Cook County, we're advancing forward-looking and comprehensive strategies that foster economic development, encourage job creation, reform our criminal justice system, and improve access to health care. Earlier this year, we spearheaded the launch of the Chicago Regional Growth Corporation, CRGC, a partnership with Cook County, the 6 collar counties, and the city of Chicago to help prioritize and coordinate economic development while increasing economic competitiveness. We're also advancing our own independent initiatives to maximize economic growth. Early in my first term, I convened a Council of Economic Advisors, which produced the Partnering for Prosperity Roadmap. It stressed the need to provide businesses with planning services, improving infrastructure through investments in public transit, and supporting the emergence of dense, mixed-use community development that includes affordable housing near job centers and transit. I'm proud of my employment initiative through the Chicago Workforce Partnership called Opportunity Works that is helping to place young adults in suburban Cook County between the ages of 16 and 24 who are otherwise disconnected from both work and school in hands-on internship programs. In its first year, Opportunity Works provided career mentoring, foundational skills training, and support services for 188 young people exploring career opportunities in high-growth sectors such as manufacturing, information technology, and transportation, distribution, and logistics, TDL. Our public safety agenda has focused on keeping people charged with nonviolent, low-level crimes out of jail. Keeping them with their families and at their jobs or school while they await the disposition of their cases strengthens communities that have historically seen the disproportionate impact of our criminal justice system on their communities. I'm proud that our work has resulted in a dramatic reduction in our jail population. In 2013, when we began this work with all the stakeholders, that's the chief judge, the state's attorney, the public defender, the sheriff, and the clerk of the court, the jail population fluctuated between 10 and 11,000. It's now stabilized to around 6,000 by reducing reliance on cash bonds. When we began this initiative in 2013, 2/3 of the people who came into bond court got a cash bond, and 1/3 were released on their own recognizance or electronic monitoring or a combination of both. And now that situation is reversed. 2/3 of the people who come into bond court get an I-bond released on their own recognizance or electronic monitoring or both, and 1/3 get a cash bond. It's through the dramatic reduction in the use of cash bonds that we've been able to drive down the jail population. Let me talk a little bit about what it costs to run jails. $300 million a year for our adult jail. Over a decade, that's $3 billion to keep people detained behind bars. And 93% of the people in our jail are awaiting trial. Only 7% are serving a sentence. So they haven't actually been convicted of the crime of which they're accused. They're simply waiting their day in court. A year for one person in our Juvenile Temporary Detention Center, the JTDC, costs $219,000. Twice as much as a year of tuition in my alma mater, the University of Chicago, which is not very far away. It's exasperating and illogical to spend so much money on detention. Though I have grave concerns about the amount of money being spent on detention at our jail and Juvenile Temporary Detention Center, I firmly believe that investing in keeping people healthy and able to go to work is an important component of fighting inequality. For more than 150 years, 161 years to be exact, our health and hospital system has provided quality care to anyone who needs it, regardless of their ability to pay. And of the 72 hospitals in Chicago, our 2 hospitals, Stroger and Provident, provide almost 50% of all the charity care delivered in the county. So we have 2 hospitals, Provident and Stroger, and we provide, I think it's 47% of the charity care delivered in Cook County. And let me just say, I think we made a big mistake when we tried to promote the Affordable Care Act, because we promoted it as a healthcare initiative, a social justice initiative. We should have promoted it as an economic development initiative, because how can you ever have an effective, competent workforce if they're not healthy, right? So if we'd said this is the, Economic Development and Healthcare Act, instead of the Affordable Care Act, we might have had better luck. It's all in how you frame things. And we need to understand that quality health care available to all of our citizens is a critical foundation of economic development. Through Medicaid expansion and the Affordable Care Act, we've created County Care, a managed care program that now has 330,000 participants. Everyone, whether or not you are insured yourself or not, should want all of us to have good health care, access to good health care. Everyone we work with, everyone we shop with, everyone we ride the bus or the train with, everybody who serves us in the restaurant. If they're healthy, we're going to be healthier. It's what Dr. Raju, a former head of our healthcare system, used to call herd health. It applies to people as well as cattle. We're making a lot of progress toward our goals, and my hope is that through continued economic development, criminal justice reforms, investment in public health and job creation, and the political will to fight for our beliefs, we can build a more equitable Chicago and Cook County. And again, I want to compliment MPC for taking on this tough issue. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Julie Morita, the Commissioner for the Chicago Department of Public Health. Thank you so much to the Metropolitan Planning Council for hosting this conversation. And thanks to President Prankwiegel and Grace Ho for your work here in Chicago to improve equity in government. And thank you also to Matthias and to Alethea in New York for sharing your experiences with us on a pre-planning conference call, and also again today with us as you come from Seattle and from New York. I was really excited. I have to admit that when I first was invited to participate, we were actually warned about the opportunity to share our receipt with you all. And so I've had a few weeks to think about it, whereas you all have a few, maybe an hour. But what I thought I would do is maybe share my personal experience and what my receipt actually is with you all. And I appreciate the acknowledgement of the lack of inclusion in Japanese American or Asian Americans in the plan itself. But as a Japanese American, the receipt that I thought of was really the cost of segregation to my family was the internment. Prior to World War II, my parents were located on the West Coast in Seattle and in Hood River, Oregon. And because there was so much segregation on the West Coast of Japanese Americans, when Pearl Harbor was bombed, there was an immediate feeling of threat because the Japanese Americans were not well integrated within the community. And so because of that, what happened to Japanese Americans was a tragedy. They were relocated into internment camps more centrally located and away from the coast. And so my parents were uprooted from their farms and their grocery stores in Seattle and in Hood River, Oregon, and then were interned in Idaho. And what they lost was property, they lost their community, they lost their homes. My dad is really the eternal optimist and will always say that what he gained was opportunity in Chicago, because he came to Chicago and he had the opportunity then to go to dental school and to become a dentist. So he did gain something, but there was a tremendous loss in the past, and that is the true cost of segregation. Because they were so segregated, they were perceived as a greater threat than they actually were. But now I'm not here to talk about that. I'm really here to talk about public health and what the Department of Public Health is doing. Thank you, President Prankwiegel. In public health, there's an oft-repeated quote: when it comes to health, your zip code matters more than your genetic code. And what this means is your individual health outcomes are influenced much more by the neighborhood that you live in and the opportunities and resources that are available to you, more than anything else, even more than your family medical history or your genetic code. And just as is in the case in other cities in the country, when we talk about the uneven distribution of resources and opportunities in Chicago, we are talking about race. We know that racial inequities didn't happen by chance. They're rooted in a history of government policies and systems that created barriers to full participation in the American dream. And it will take work on the part of government to dismantle these barriers. There's significant work happening across Chicago as we direct resources more intentionally to close racial equity gaps. At CDPH, we're leaning in to this fundamental mission and supporting city partners for their efforts. For instance, the Neighborhood Opportunity Fund and Fund 77 are generating millions of dollars in new investment to support neighborhoods and in need of jobs and economic growth. Through Vision Zero, the city departments are coming together with communities that experience high rates of traffic crashes to eliminate fatalities and serious injuries by 2026. And a task force of city agencies is implementing a collective response to homelessness. And that barely scratches the surface. For public health, in 2016, CDPH and Mayor Emanuel launched Healthy Chicago 2.0, our plan to improve health equity throughout the city of Chicago, which really means improving racial equity. It's an ambitious plan with more than 200 outward-facing strategies, addressing traditional public health issues that adversely affect Black and brown communities, like substance use and tobacco prevention. But it also addresses root causes of health, including education, housing, and economic opportunity. At the same time, CDPH also launched in our internal strategic plan, focused on internal changes that we need to address, to make as an organization. Our strategic plan focuses directly on addressing racial equity within our own department, with the goal of becoming stronger, more equitable, so that we can then begin to build a stronger, more equitable city. This shift toward racial equity in our department is an ongoing process. It's a journey. But by committing our goals to paper and making these goals part of our everyday work, we are starting to see progress. As part of this work, we're engaging experts in the field. Many of our staff already have gone through an intensive 3-day People's Institute anti-racism training. When I participated in this training, it was a long 3 days. I'm not used to having to have my cell phone to my side and not participating in meetings or being distracted all the time, but it was an enlightening experience. Where my dad had actually benefited from the GI Bill after he was relocated here in Chicago and was able to go to college, I always thought of it as a real positive thing. And then in that training, I learned about the negative impact the GI Bill had in terms of segregation. And so it was very, very enlightening, understanding these systems and these structures that are in place that have prevented us from becoming more integrated. But after completing that training, a good portion of our staff participated last year, we really felt a bit raw. We felt like the Band-Aid had been ripped off. And so we now recognize there were these problems and these structural systems and systems that were in place to prevent us from being better able to address race equity. And so what we've done since then is we've actively engaged the Government Alliance for Race and Equity, and many of us have attended their national meeting here in Chicago to actually, and we are joining them. We actually have joined membership with GARE so that we will get the guidance from them and technical assistance from them and the other members within GARE to move forward and create the systems and the policies within our department so that we can actually address and be ready to address racial equity throughout the city. We've already started reviewing our hiring practices and have added language in our requirements so that staff are required to communicate in a wide variety of languages, from Spanish to Polish to Mandarin. And we're updating our standard RFP, or request for proposal languages, to support gender and racial equity issues. Our process involves constant feedback, collaboration, iteration, and work. In order for us to do that in a meaningful way, we created a staff cultural leadership team, which brings together voices from across our department at all levels so that we can implement the goals of our strategic plan, and we can also have leadership from within the department and also get the feedback from all levels within the department to make sure that we really are improving racial equity within the department. This process also requires financial support. We have to have some dedicated resources and commitment to do this. And so for the first time ever, the department has hired a director of equity, and we are making progress. And yes, it took us 150 years to hire a staff member who has the word equity in their title, but we have done that. So we acknowledge we are just getting started with our work. but it's arguably the most important work we as an organization and as a city can do. CDPH is up for the challenge, and we're committed to working with other city departments and agencies to support their racial equity journeys too. There's a famous Chicago talk show host who has a plethora of inspirational phrases and quotes, but I'm not going to paraphrase her, I'm going to paraphrase another Chicago talk show host, Jerry Springer, who used to sign off his show every day with, "Take care of yourself and each other." That actually resonates really closely to me, because if we take care of ourselves in the department, then we're best prepared to take care of others. So as the department continues to do this meaningful work, we will be better equipped to have a more lasting, sustainable, and meaningful, impactful effort in Chicago. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you. So my name is Grace Ho, and I'm the president of Woods Fund Chicago, and it's a pleasure to be here this morning with all of you. Really, truly inspirational already. Thanks again to the leadership of Metropolitan Planning Council, who is really elevating this conversation around racial equity and what we need to do as a city, as a region, in order for outcomes to be accessible to all. So some of the words that are kind of bouncing around my head from this morning already is, you know, we need political courage, and that's not big P political courage necessarily. I think you've heard from some governmental leaders already that the political courage exists. There is a roadmap that Metropolitan Planning Council has developed, and I think one of the things that I would say about that is that the road is very wide. And the road is very wide because it needs to include all of us, all different sectors. It's not just a government responsibility. It's not just nonprofits and foundations. It's everybody, including the private sector as well. You know, the story catchers, singers reminded us that we need to imagine what we could be. And while dollars and cents are critically important, it's also about the outcomes of us as people. The median, so 30% of homicides would be decreased, right, if we had median rates of segregation. 83,000 more bachelor's degrees. Imagine what we could be as a region. And the commissioner talked about zip codes mattering more than genetic code. This can't be okay with us anymore. And so, why am I here? So I'm the president of Woods Fund Chicago. We're a private grant-making foundation. We fund community organizing and public policy advocacy on issues of race and poverty. And prior to that, I worked in state government for almost 10 years as well. And so I've seen from the inside the power of government, the power to change and influence folks' lives in a very positive way. And I think one of the things that I've been thinking on as I have this role in philanthropy now, and being able to look on my years in government service is that there is an underappreciation, I think, in the value of civil servants and public service. It is a tireless job, I have to tell you, that it's a 365-day-a-week job, 24 hours a day. I was, one of the first weeks that I was at Woods Fund after being in state government, I was carrying my cell phone to the bathroom with me. And what I realized was that there are no philanthropic emergencies that can't wait 5 minutes. But in government, there is not. And so this tireless job is critically important. And as I reflect on this journey that I've taken since being at Woods Fund, as Woods Fund adopted a racial equity lens 10 years ago, and so I've had the luxury of learning and growing and evolving my learning in this area, is that government has this dual role as it relates to structural racism, right? It certainly keeps it alive. It produces it, but it also has that dichotomy in that it could also alleviate and solve those problems. And so that's the conversation we have today before us. So thank you so much, Ryan, for I think really setting forth a thought-provoking exercise for all of us as it relates to the segregation receipts exercise. And even though, Commissioner Morita, I did have more time to think about it, I really just sat in the moment to really think what would come to mind. And what I thought about was similar to Ryan's in that it has to do with neighborhoods and the communities that you grow up in. So I grew up in LaGrange, Illinois. Me and my family were probably the only immigrant family in our neighborhood, as well as the only Asian Americans, and in fact the only people of color. And so I always felt growing up that I had the Chinese part of me and then the not Chinese part of me, or the part of me that was trying to blend in with the rest of my school. And so I do think that it costs me human connection, and I think one of the things that we struggle with, as Alden said, as Asian Americans, is where is our political power? I think we see that changing with more Asian Americans who are being elected, but what has that time frame been? And it has taken us quite a while. So before we engage in some conversation, I want to ask any of the panelists, Commissioner, you already commented, if you had any reflections on the receipt exercise.
So I grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota, in a predominantly white community where there were 2 black families at our school. And so it's similar to the story that was told by our artist. That is, there are ways in which I had more opportunity, but missed the connections to the broader African American community. But I often say that it was formative in lots of ways. I learned that I could be successful in an environment that was not predominantly African American, that is successful in school. But I also got called nigger a lot, and I tell the story about fighting my way home from school. Now, what I usually say about that is, it made me, in a way, courageous, because I know that I will never be 6 or 7 or 8 again and have to fight my way home from school. And so whatever else happens to me in life, that is in a lot of ways the worst. And so the cost for me was being called nigger all the time and having to fight my way home from school. On the other hand, I'm not afraid of white people. And I think for a lot of black people, there is this, at our core, fear of white people, not just because we've suffered so terribly at the hands of the majority in this country, but also just in sort of interpersonal relationships. It's not something I would ever wish on my children. I brought them up in an environment where, in a very racially integrated neighborhood in Hyde Park. But when I look at my childhood, I have to think of both the ways in which I was, in a strange way, empowered by that awful experience, and also damaged.
Thank you. Matthias?
Sure. I'll tell some of my story. I'm from Chile originally, and I moved to Seattle in 1994. One of the things there is I moved into what had been predominantly an African-American neighborhood, which is the central area, and specifically Madison Valley. And historically, the central area, due to redlining and covenants and housing restrictions, had been the place where African-Americans and also the early Chinese and Japanese settlers had established themselves in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Much younger history than the Chicago area. So at that point, really communities were, and communities of color, the ones that existed, were forced to be in that part of Seattle. And now really the pressure is the affordability crisis that we have in our region, driven by high-tech industry and others. And for me, it's very personal. In the neighborhood, I've had Black, Latino, and Asian neighbors, and just to see how that changed, and what really hit me home was the house right next to mine. A gentleman in his 70s, his mother in her 90s, who sold their house to a developer, African-American family, and sold it to a developer, who then went on and sold it for close to 4 times the price of what the house was bought for. And then to see that the gentleman actually, next time I saw him was in a trailer coming by the neighborhood. asking whether he could actually live in that property in his trailer until the developers had finished the construction. So, I mean, for me, it hits all those categories, but the human connection and the cost there was quite steep.
Thanks, Matthias. So Matthias Valenzuela, and I should have probably introduced him earlier, but his bio is in your program. He's the director of King County Office of Equity and Social Justice. We're glad that you were able to make it despite the weather. And so we're going to be able to have a more intimate conversation because Dr. Mayweather, unfortunately, was not able to make it, as Marisa shared. So King County Office of Equity and Social Justice. So this was established 10 years ago, right? There's been a lot of work that has occurred over the past 10 years. And so one of the things that I'm really interested in is the origin story. How did this work take hold in King County?
Great. Yeah, and we launched as an initiative about 10 years ago, and really listening to the story of Cook County and the health department too very much resonated, because actually we started much sooner than that. And back in 2002, now about 16 years ago, we had several hundred of our employees, managers, and leaders also go through Undoing Institutionalized Racism training. And I think that was extremely important to bring both frontline staff with managers, supervisors, and our leadership together in a forum to begin to address this. And this was at a time too, and I think that's one of the advantages of doing this work now, is that I think kind of the Band-Aid has been ripped off and we're really talking about it. I think at that time, it wasn't so much in the news every single day, and I think it was a little bit harder of a conversation. In our area too, we have a tendency to be very, what people call Pacific Northwest nice. So really, we talk about racism, but people pretend to not be racist, but at the end, it all plays out, but in very subtle ways. So it can be even more challenging. But the conversation started early, and we had a lot of different, in the criminal justice area and public health and different areas, we had work that was happening around disproportionality, around disparities, but it wasn't coordinated. But there was a lot of energy to do something. And I think it took kind of that bottom-up pressure from employees and from community as well. Plus, at that point in 2008, our executive, Ron Sims, really he'd been, I think I really enjoyed the fact that data has been talked about so much, because that became very key in the early years of our work, to, by race and by place, to show the differences that we see across all determinants of equity, is what we call them, often called the social determinants of health. We call them, you know, it's access to good paying jobs, education, transportation, housing, et cetera. And we really began to document that. And that was also driven by our executive at the time, Ron Sims, who had seen some national, the Dellins Commission report, which had been released, and then brought that back and said, let's look at that information locally. And we basically mirrored those disparities that we were seeing nationally. And in some areas, since we have such areas that are so wealthy and predominantly white, our disparities in many areas are even among the largest in the country. So that was really a call to action, and to have that leadership at that time from our executive, Ron Sims, to launch it really helped us to do this as an initiative. And then one of the key things then with our existing executive, Dow Constantine, who's now in his third term, he came in 2010 and said, we need to really drop initiative from the term. This needs to be part of our ongoing work. And since then, it's been one of the 4 county priorities, along with climate change, transportation, and best run government. So it's said this is not just a, you know, can't be on the sidelines. It can't be understaffed and under-resourced. And then actually what happened also in 2010 is we passed out an ordinance. So we had council passed our equity and social justice ordinance, so making it actually law within the county. That needs to be incorporated into policies and decision-making, into organizational practices, into our work with the community. And since then, that allowed us to begin to do the work and to practice. And I think, as Commissioner, you're talking about now, there's GARE, the Government Alliance for Race and Equity. There's a lot of toolkits out there, but that time, we didn't have all those tools. So we developed our own equity impact review tools, our community engagement tools, and began to get, you know, practice under our belt to begin to do this better. For example, we incorporated it into our budget, and every year we get a little bit more clearer and better in terms of how we do our analysis. We ask for every decision package, for example, we ask how is this decision benefiting low-income communities, communities of color, and immigrant refugee populations. How have you included community in this decision? And if you're not, it doesn't benefit, what are you doing to mitigate the negative effects? So things like that with time. Eventually, we got our equity office, not until 2015. It started as 3 staff, now it's 7, and now also the roadmap that we have now is an equity and social justice strategic plan.
So clearly folks in this room are very engaged and have this similar goal in achieving racial equity. And so to learn from your path over 10 years, it's clearly, I'm assuming, hasn't been a smooth, linear path. And so one of the things that I'm curious to know is, I think that the opponents of this type of kind of broad sweeping kind of agenda setting is this notion of zero-sum game, right? That in order for equity to be achieved, there has to be redistribution. And some folks may be satisfied with the status quo. So with 10 years under your belt, what are lessons that our region can learn in mitigating some of those kind of fear tactics?
Yeah, so it's, I mean, there's a lot of evidence around this too, both organizationally. You can see Harvard Business Review, others who talk about how diversity and true diversity within organizations actually benefit and produce better work. So it's not just a feel-good thing, it's actually how to get the work done better. So when you have different ideas, different identities, different races, working in groups effectively, it makes for better products. And then we also know there was a time in which also in terms of income inequality was thought of as, it was certain more, perhaps French groups that were saying that it was, that was bad for the economy. Now it's actually very mainstream. World Bank, IMF, Standard & Poor's, so they have basically all been documenting how the places that the smaller inequities are the places where everybody benefits. You have more long-term sustained economic growth. So the case for it is extremely strong, regardless of the sector that we're talking about. We have tons of lessons. I don't know if you want me to get into those now. Or
yes, please do.
Sure. So I think one of the things I mentioned at the very end of my comments, too, in terms of what is really guiding us and is our strategic plan that has both some very specific, because at first we were kind of 1,000 points of light. Every equity action would be good. People would just do, departments and agencies would all do their commitments. Now we're being much more thoughtful and intentional in terms of what departments and agencies need to do. And this is everybody. This is transportation, health, our whole criminal justice, because it includes our separately electeds as well. And we have 4 strategies that really come from the deep engagement that we did with community, with our partners in terms of this work. I think the process is as important as some of the plans and goals that we set out. So we actually try to model in terms of how we work with community and how we work with our employees in terms of then what guides our work. In terms of our strategies, one strategy is invest upstream and where needs is greatest. So really, and this is different and very challenging for some of our electeds as well when we say, hey, we need to actually put our resources in those areas, in those communities where the needs are greatest. We can't continue to spread this and the resources like peanut butter. And then really thinking about how we move upstream. So one of the things that we have more recently done in terms of criminal justice and juvenile detention, we've moved juvenile detention under our public health department. And thinking about it less from a punitive perspective and looking at it from a more humane, looking upstream, and about really the community conditions in the neighborhoods that we want to establish for those. Also, a second strategy that we have is invest in community partnerships. We heard from our communities and our partner organizations that we tend to be very episodic. We use, as government, we use community when we need them. What they want us is to have more real relationships where we really fund them. Also invest in our employees. We are, as a county, we have 14,000 employees. So we think of them as our greatest assets, but if we think about it organizationally, we're quite diverse in lower paid positions, but not very diverse in the higher paid positions. So really doing that work to make sure that we develop the pipelines, set very specific, we have some anti-affirmative action laws in our state that limit us in terms of setting targets, but it doesn't mean we can't set goals. So we have some very aggressive goals of racially diversifying our workforce and really developing the toolkits and the other things to make that happen. And then also changing the culture. This is deep work that needs to happen. So now I'm in the process this year of training 1,000 of our managers and supervisors in a 3-day racial justice training. And we know to actually have the lens. I know sometimes people say, hey, let's do a half day, let's do a lunchtime, lunch and learn. Those are good, but we really need some deep work. And then the final one is around transparent and accountable leadership. I think we've done more and more. We're going to be releasing some public reporting in which we show across our departments and agencies where we're making progress and where we're not, because that's what our community is asking us to do.
Thank you. President Preckwinkle, I understand that you're developing a policy roadmap for the county. And could you tell us a bit about the role that racial equity will play in that plan, in that process?
Well, I think I'll begin at the beginning. One of the things we did early on was create a council of economic advisors, and we brought a couple dozen corporate leaders in, headed first by Rick Waddell and John Rogers, and now led by John Rogers alone, not only to give us advice about how we could better use our own resources, but also how we should relate to the business community. And I referred to it in my speech. They came up with a report called Partnering for Prosperity. And one of the things it said was we should try to take a leadership role in bringing together the actors in northeastern Illinois, which is the economic engine for our state, to try to get people to work together to build up our region. And in January, we had the kickoff of the Chicago Regional Growth Corporation, which is focused on economic development for our region, transportation, distribution, and logistics. It's truck permitting, since we're the capital of the Midwest, and a lot of long-haul trucks come through here, as well as a lot of intermodal train-to-truck and truck-to-train traffic. Focusing on an industrial sector, metalworking, foreign direct investment, and helping small and mid-sized firms export more because they have a better growth trajectory when they do that. And our focus was trying to, I won't say even out, try to be sure that the whole region was advancing. And one of the things we found is in our work in the region is that we have pretty high rates of inequality. And to go back to the point that was made earlier, those regions are most successful that have the least inequality. And so inequality is one of the things we're going to have to try to address through our work. In the county alone, looking at which communities, which parts of the county were struggling the most, it's clearly the south suburbs. And so we've focused our infrastructure and our economic development activity in the south suburbs. Because again, if we can lift up the south suburbs, we know we will lift up the entire region. So both in our 7-county regional initiative and within the county itself, we're trying to figure out how we can lift those parts of the communities and parts of the economy that are struggling so that we can benefit everybody. And that's the case we try to make, that it's to everybody's benefit. Again, going back to the point about those regions that are the most economically vibrant have the least inequality.
Thank you. So, Commissioner Morita, in our planning call, we learned from Dr. Maybank, and obviously from information prior to that, we know that in New York City, a lot of this race equity work began in the City Department of Health. In listening to your comments, and knowing all the incredible work that you've been doing as well, why do you think some municipalities' work as it relates to racial equity starts in the health department?
So thanks for that question. I think it's interesting. The Department of Public Health launched our plan, Healthy Chicago 2.0, in 2016. And all our work for decades and decades has been based on data. So it's interesting that Matthias brought that up. But when we looked at the data, what we found were striking health disparities. If you looked at life expectancy, you could see that life expectancy was dramatically different just a few train rides away on the red line or on the blue line. And so it's remarkable. And we started focusing on health equity, because there's clearly a problem with health equity. But the reality is health equity really is race equity. And so it was easier for us to talk about health equity than it was to talk about race equity. But as we've been on this journey ourselves, we realize that race equity is really, really relevant to us. But I think my sense is actually that what's made it easier for us to actually move forward and work in this area is because we have the data that point out the disparities in health outcome, in economic differences as well. We have good data that really makes it clear. So departments of public health throughout the nation actually do surveys. We do our own telephone survey. It's called Healthy Chicago Survey, which we've done for the past 4 years, and it collects very granular data for the city of Chicago, and we actually are able to estimate small neighborhood level health outcomes, health behavior kind of information. And so it gives us really timely information about these small geographies. So it helps us highlight and understand racial differences, geographic differences as well. And then we've also, because we recognize how important these data are for our communities, we've made those data available through the Health Atlas. So we have, if you go to healthatlas.org, chicagohealthatlas.org, you can actually go to a site which makes all these data available to community groups, to the public, to academics, so the data are available. But when you look at those data, it's so clear that we need to be working in this way. And this is the direction that we need to be heading. And I think public health in Chicago is no different than public health in other jurisdictions. I think we have always been very data-driven, data-oriented. And so when we see these stark differences, we really are motivated to move forward and to address it.
Thank you. And so this question is for Matthias, but I'd welcome President Frank-Winkler, Commissioner Morita to answer as well. So it sounds like some of the ingredients are good, strong, compelling data, training, right? Racial equity training in a deep, thoughtful way, bottom-up leadership as well as top-down. And so if these are some of the key ingredients, how have you seen this work transform into policy change in a deep and meaningful way?
There's a lot of things. So basically our theory of change around our equity and social justice work, one of the levies that we have passed now is Best Starts for Kids in King County, which is a levy to support early child development, 0 to 5, then youth, and then place-based initiatives. So for example, around our place-based initiative, we now have levy-funded work that is supporting 3 communities, which are the communities with our lowest health, economic, and housing indicators, to do some long-term commitments in those areas, which is very different from how we have done the work in the past. So this is our Communities Opportunity Initiative, where we go in and we say, hey, we're going to go in not just for 2 or 3 years, how we've usually done it. We're going in for the long term. We need at least 10 years. These have taken a long time to create these issues. We need a similar amount of time to do it. So really, through collective impact approach, supporting backbone organizations. And then the other thing is it allows us now, for us, it took us a while to really explicitly focus on racial equity. I think we were all often talking about equity and social justice, and we were a bit shy of saying that. Now we're actually calling it out very explicitly. And there's really a need. If we look at the justice system in terms of youth, we have been able to reduce the number of incarcerated from about 200 any given night to about 50, which is quite low, among the lowest per capita in the country. But our disproportionality in terms of black and brown youth has gotten worse. So that is a push, and that's why with our new strategic plan, we say we're actually leading with racial justice, because we need to get very specific in terms of the strategies for our, in this case, the black and brown youth. And this now gives us that okay to be able to do that.
Well, I just go back to what I said earlier. I mean, we've reallocated our resources, both our infrastructure investments and our economic development investments and our housing investments to those parts of the, instead of, as he said, so eloquently spreading things around like peanut butter, concentrating them in those parts of our county which we know are in desperate need of support.
So, okay, last question. My last question for all of you is, so if you look across this room, we're diverse in many aspects, but I'm going to focus on the diversity of the different sectors we represent. So you have foundation folks, you have artists, you have business leaders, we have young people, we have community leaders. So what do you all need from the rest of us in order to be able to lead the racial equity work from the vantage point that you are at?
So one thing we need is for rooms like this to be more diverse. Sorry, but it's true. So that's incumbent on all of us. You know, all of the organizations that are represented in this room need to be more diverse. There aren't enough African American, Latino, and Asian people in this room to talk about an issue that profoundly impacts those communities. So that's on all of us. You know, and I think the other thing is, so that's internal work. Externally, we have to talk about race, and we have to talk about the impacts of racism in this country, and those are often discomforting, dicey conversations. But you know, if we don't talk about it, we're never going to be able to address it. I mean, the history of denying racism and marginalizing people who talk about race and the importance of race and what's happened to people of color in this country. You know, we have to go in the other direction. And so that's incumbent upon each of us to take up that torch and to try to help us move collectively to a better place.
That's a hard question. I think there's a number of things that would be beneficial for us. Because of our plan being so much outside of the traditional medical delivery and healthcare service focus, we need to be able to engage non-traditional partners. And so some of you are non-traditional partners, and some of you we've engaged with very well. So I look around the room and I see a lot more familiar faces than I would have 2 years ago because we hadn't worked with you before. Well, we definitely are working with you more now, but I feel like there's a need for us to better engage with the financial sector, business sector, financial sector, philanthropy to move forward more positively and to help support some of the work that we're doing. The Department of Public Health, our budget is 80% grant funded. We have 80% of our funds come from federal agencies, mostly in some state funding, and so they come with very specific deliverables. Reduce HIV, reduce lead poisoning. We don't get funding to address racial equity. And so this is something that we need to do across the board to improve all those health outcomes, and yet there's not dedicated resources to do that. And so if anybody wants to give us some money, we'd gladly take it, and we'll do good things with it, I promise you. So there is this financial need that I think is there. We are committing city resources to this, clearly, but we need more to really do it the right way. So I would welcome any kind of, anybody that wants to talk to me after this. But I do feel like this partnership is really, really important, or staying engaged, being willing to partner with us. These cross-sector collaborations are going to be essential. As Matthias pointed out earlier, we didn't get here overnight. We're not going to resolve this overnight, so it's going to take long-term, long-lasting commitment to address this issue. And we're ready and we're willing, so we want you all to be as well.
So a couple things. One is accountability, I think, is extremely important. Being accountable internally to people within our organization, but most importantly to community. At the end, at least as government, that's who we serve. And for us, just kind of setting up those systems and being in situations where we are in constant dialogue with community and actually being responsive to them. And you know, equity, there are a lot of frameworks out there and definitions, but eventually, at its heart, it's how do we really are responsive to the needs of our community. And if you're able to do that well, then that is really about doing the equity work. And I think the other component is around courage. I think it's not easy work, and it's going to be, in terms of politically, in terms of for other people who do the work, it can be very hard, but at the same time, it can be the most rewarding work. And some of the things that we have, and that's what I'm thankful in terms of our county executive and others who've been able to really champion this and say that we're doing this, is as you start leading with racial justice, for example, our investigations and our complaints from employees around race issues. I also have civil rights within my office, so that we get those employee complaints. Those go up. I mean, we're going to begin to uncover things that it's not that those things are new. Those things have existed all along, but now people have the confidence and have the belief in government to think that actually we're going to be doing something about it. So I see those all as signs of hope, and that people are actually feeling empowered, whether in the community or internally, to be able to raise these things. But I think it does take a lot of courage, because it's not easy work. It can be some of the most draining work.
So I want to thank all of our panelists for the courage that they are demonstrating, and in years to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these great examples of leadership in government. In our next panel, moderated by Raul Ramundo from the Resurrection Project, we'll explore the role of the rest of us. Come on up. I'll say one more word. Yep. All right, let's dive in. These are people paving the way in philanthropy, private sector, nonprofits, and individuals. And for this panel, we will have Q&A, so you have a note card on your chair. We'll have staff come around in a little bit to collect those, so if you have a question for our panel, we'll be sure to get those to Raul, our moderator, and I'll turn it over to you, Raul.
Thank you, Marisa. It's really exciting to be part of this panel, this great distinguished. We're not going to go into introductions. All the information about our distinguished panelists is in your book. We're going to get right into it because I really want to make sure that we participate with the audience as much as we can. We were all asked, including myself, to do this exercise on the receipt. And I've been thinking about it. Let me just reflect on it from my perspective. It's around education. Several stories, but one, I grew up in Pilsen. I went to Benito Juarez High School, and I was fortunate enough to go away to Carleton College. And in my freshman year, you talk about where you're from, who you're with, and so forth. But one of the questions that came up, I asked my roommate, Andy, when did you first learn you were going to go to college? And he said, I don't know, but my parents knew the moment I was born. And I asked him, how did that happen, right? So it's because they started a college fund for me, right? I didn't think about any kind of college finances until probably junior or senior year of high school. And then the other is the experience that going to Benito Juarez High School, where 100% of the students in my classroom were Hispanic, Mexican immigrant, to go into a place where it was the opposite. 1 out of 30 students in the classroom was Hispanic, if you will. I think I increased the enrollment of Carleton College Hispanic enrollment by 100% is what I tell my peers. So those kinds of experiences shape me in terms of the work that I do because it allowed me to really look at different things. But those experiences still exist today. I would argue that many high schools today still have 95%, 90% either students that are black or students that are Hispanic, and when they go on to their next level, these are the struggles they face. They're not ready, both academically, nowadays emotionally, let alone financially, for the rigor that awaits us to come back and prepare. And I want to reflect on that because in the study, the cost of segregation, we lost over 80,000 bachelor degrees. How many of those probably, as I look back, could have come from my high school, I'm dating myself, 30 years ago, if you will. The other is, as an immigrant coming to this country when I was 7 years old, there's still a lot of challenges for immigrants. Just to give you another example is, most recently, as I was talking to a relative of mine, he happened to purchase he happens to be undocumented. He purchased a car at the dealership, and his interest rate was 28%. Right? So the little disposable income that sometimes families have is getting sucked away too. So it's challenges that like this that, and these kinds of events that makes us reflect, how do we deal with these costs of economic and racial segregation? So that's my story. I'm going to ask the panelists, each of you, to reflect on your sort of receipt, and I'm going to start here with Joe and go down the aisle.
So I did also think a lot about this, and I think that the receipt is enormous in the value of trust and the fact that so much in business and in our social lives is built on trust, and segregation means that we don't have it. And I've certainly, as we've been exploring this at IFF, you realize when you don't have trust how much more difficult everything is. And I think sometimes us as white people, we just assume trust. I'm learning really quickly that I shouldn't assume anything. And in fact, the deficit is so large. And when we think about, Stephen Covey talks about the speed of trust in business and in engagement. And without trust, how much more difficult it is for all of us to work on these incredible challenges that we have in society. So I think that receipt is just absolutely enormous.
Angelique, your own personal receipt?
So I love this exercise. Thank you, Ryan Blocker. And I want to recognize Nina Sanchez, who's here also from Enrich Chicago. When this came up, I was like, what are my receipts? And then I was like, doot, 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 doot. Like I just started like piling up receipts. My father was a sergeant in Chicago police. For 40 years, he was on the force, a black police officer. Started in 1957. Took the test every year, but was never able, even though he passed it, was never able to move to a lieutenant level. So he was always a sergeant. And because of that, he worked 3 jobs. And my mother, who was a Chicago public school teacher, worked 2 jobs. So the cost was, you know, we were basically taking care of ourselves, of our siblings and each other, while our parents worked to be able to get us clothes and, you know, put us through school and all of that. So that's one. I mean, I have like a list of things, but I'll save that for cocktails.
Melissa? Thank you. I had a similar reaction when Marisa shared with me the exercise. It was like, okay, where do you begin? And they're all intertwined to some degree. But I grew up in Joliet, Illinois, and even though the community has a lot of diversity as a whole, I found that I was always in the gifted classes. And in the gifted classes, I was the only one, the only black girl in those classes. And there's, I think my receipt is that there's always a sense of having to prove that you belong. And there's a, you know, so it's a double experience, because even though, you know, in these classrooms you have to prove that you belong, it also teaches you confidence that I have used throughout my career, because there's still many instances that I've had over my long career that I have been the only one. So you translate those experiences and skills. But there is, I think it's more of an emotional receipt that you have constantly thinking about how you have to be more prepared, you have to be an Excel grader, you know, than others in the class. And it's a degree also of lack of automatic acceptance. You know, when you're in the room and you're the only one, you don't see or hear others question why everybody else is there, but they're really kind of focused on, oh, you're different, you're unique. How did this happen? Well, I studied just like you did, so.
Oh. Well, my story obviously maybe a little bit different, but I think in some ways also similar. I grew up just down the lake in Hammond, Indiana. And in the 60s and 70s, if you looked at the statistics, you would say, well, Hammond's pretty integrated. But I would venture, was one of the most segregated places to grow up, maybe in the country. Very prescribed neighborhoods. We stayed in our neighborhoods. Other folks stayed in their neighborhoods. And then somebody came up with the idea that they would create a middle school that would draw on elementary schools that were essentially not integrated at all, bring us all together just as we were starting puberty. And so I will tell you, that's too late to start interacting with people from other backgrounds and other cultures. And it was rough when it started out. It got worse before it got better when I headed off to Eggers Middle School. But I will tell you, as time went by, I started to realize the folks who weren't from Kenwood Elementary, who didn't look like me, some of them I liked hanging out with, at least during school hours and in sports. And I started to focus on what became a kind of lifelong journey for me of focusing in on a journey, by the way, I thought was over, but I recently found out it's not. But to focusing in on what we had in common, what we shared. Now, my parents, I should say, even though we lived in a very white, segregated neighborhood, my parents had a very, I don't recall, even with my grandparents who lived in the neighborhood, anyone ever saying anything racist, but their interaction with other people was almost nil with folks from other cultures. I mean, I didn't know somebody who wasn't Catholic or Protestant until I got to college. But my journey led me to the University of Chicago, where obviously the people that I knew, the philosophies that were espoused there, again, that way of thinking that said, I'm going to focus on what I have in common with people, how they are like me, versus how we're different. And we chose to, through another series of coincidences, to raise our family in Flossmoor. And I will say that, if again, when we moved to Flossmoor in the late 80s, it was probably less diverse on paper than Hammond. But the difference was we all lived together. And there wasn't this strict neighborhood boundaries. And I always thought honestly, I didn't think of it as a receipt. I was thinking more of it as a bonus because my kids' attitudes about race and interacting with people at their age in their 20s, so much better than mine was because of how they grew up. So I guess I always thought that was their bonus by the decision and circumstances to raise the kids in a town like Flossmoor. But maybe it's a receipt for the setbacks, the anger, the years it took me to find that I can interact with people from all sorts of backgrounds, and I try to get better at it all the time.
Thank you, Paul. We're going to keep that concept bonus. It's about what we're doing forward. Angelique, since your arrival at the Field Foundation, perhaps because of your own background experiences that you said you wanted to talk about at cocktail, you have taken tremendous leadership in how you look at your now giving through this equity racial lens. Could you talk about what you're doing at the Field Foundation?
In July of 2016, I came to the Field Foundation. This was maybe 7 months after the Laquan McDonald video was released. We were about a year into the state budget being frozen, and we were only halfway through what would turn out to be the second bloodiest chapter year in Chicago's history. And so I was coming from a different foundation where I had been, some folks have mentioned the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, the trainings that they do. I had been actively involved with PISB for the last 5 years, which is a mind expander and gives you sort of the glasses to decode systemic racism, to understand institutional racism, and understand all of our complicity in individual racism. So I had actually come to the Field Foundation as a skeptic of philanthropy, really kind of asking if foundations could get out of their own way to achieve the goals that they want to achieve. And the Field Foundation, who had been led by the last 2 leaders prior to me, were African Americans, Handy Lindsay and Ori Pennick, trailblazers, and the board had been purposefully working on diversifying itself over the last 30 years, had been building trust by funding inside of communities, doing site visits, showing up. The organization, the board and staff were hungry to rethink philanthropy and rethink how they operated, and I was the right skeptic to do that with. So we went through a process. We asked nonprofit organizations to review us for a change and asked them to give us feedback on what we could do better, and then also to kick the tires of philanthropy writ large. We also did a racial justice training with our board and staff. And I want to underline that because often racial justice, racial equity is something that happens at the staff level inside of organizations, but it never makes its way up to the board. And I think for me, and I've said this before, but I was really scared to do the racial justice training with the board and staff. It was a month after the presidential election. I had been at the Field Foundation for 4 or 5 months. And as others have stated, that when you actually open these doors, you don't know what is going to happen, and you do know that it's going to get harder. But I believe that none of us know how to talk about race. We don't. We're scared of offending, we're scared of being offended, and so we don't talk about it. So in philanthropy, we're race agnostic. We work on behalf of you know, marginalized communities. And that actually creates impact metrics where we expect nonprofits to behave like large, predominantly white nonprofits. And we penalize those that are not behaving that way. So from our metrics to our investments to our boards to our way of applying for funding, we are upholding systems that are not only not meant for everyone, we are upholding systemic racism, which is not what any of us want to do. So the first step is getting trained, having conversations, and learning how to rethink.
Thank you. Melissa, you work in an industry that produces a product that has to go to everyone regardless of race, income, gender, whatever, and that is energy and electricity. However, I understand that through your work, you need to make sure that the people delivering that product is diverse because it's important to the company, it's important to the city. Can you talk about your experience?
Yes, you definitely hit on it. I think, you know, with ComEd being the utility electric provider to 70% of Illinois, it definitely puts us in a unique position in that everyone we interact with is a customer, but they're also, in many instances, are partners, you know, whether it's a community partner, business partner, or as President Preckwinkle talked about, we're also in partnership with many government agencies to advance our common objectives. But also, we employ people from the community. And so when we have people out there working every day, we really think about how do we overlay our values of our company across everything that we do every day, interacting with every single one of stakeholders, whether they're our customers, partners, or our community partners. And you know, couple of things that we really focus on in terms of value that I think will be helpful to share, and you understand kind of how we make our decisions, is that safety is very, very important to us. You know, we want our employees to come to work, but we also want them to go home to their families every day. Safety is unique in our business because of the fact that when we talk about safety, our workplace is out in the streets. Many people have their jobs where they're, you know, if we probably went 2 blocks, you know, south from here, we would run into probably a ComEd crew working in an alley to maintain the system. And so they're not, you know, behind closed doors that we have control over safety for them. So therefore, it's very important for us to focus on how do we make the overall community safe, or how do we contribute to that cause. The other area that we do focus on also is around diversity and inclusion. We focus on it in terms of our employee base, as you mentioned, you know, so the people that are working for us every day, making sure it's a diverse and inclusive workforce. But we also think about who we contract with. You know, how do we make other businesses stronger, and how do we help support diverse companies grow? And that's something that we also strive for. But as I mentioned, you know, we're recruiting from the community, and what we have found is that you have to be very deliberate, and you have to start early to make sure that you have an adequate pool of candidates. You know, one of the things that we learned back in 2012, we had the passing of significant legislation that allowed us to modernize the grid, and along with that significant investment was going to be an increase, a very large increase in opportunities. And we wanted to make sure that diverse candidates had access to those opportunities. And you can get access by coming up with diverse slates, making sure you're going and recruiting from the communities in where the candidates reside. But we realize that you have to do something further. There's many times that you can give access, but you may not see the product, or you may not see the impact that you're trying to have in terms of having a diverse group of a pool of candidates come in and actually get those jobs. So we took it a step further and said, well, what are the obstacles that people are coming across that prevent them from competing at the level to ensure that not only are they having access to these roles, but they're also getting the roles. And so we created a program called Construct in 2013 that is designed specifically to introduce building trades and construction jobs to diverse employees or diverse people who had previously not had access or the information that they needed to be able to compete for these jobs. So we started this program in 2013. We started with just working with the 7 partners, other construction small companies that worked with us and did some of our work and said, hey, would you be willing to recruit from the pool of candidates if we are able to show you that over several weeks, not only do we give them skill set training, but we also give them information and life skills to make them even better employees when they come on board. And so we started out this endeavor by working with 3 social agencies who had access to the diverse pool of candidates that we were looking for and developed a 9-week program that will give them all those skills, information, and resources to help them pass what we would call the entry-level test, if you will, to get into the industry. And when it started out, it was pretty small, but we just had our now 6th graduation in April of this month, or last month, and we had 95 people graduate.
That's fantastic.
And up to this point, we've had over 400 people go through those programs, and those people are now employed in the building construction trades. It makes them definitely more marketable, and the types of positions that they take on and the wealth that it builds in their family makes a big difference in their lives.
Thank you, thank you. Joe, Joe, for those of you who don't know, Joe and I know each other since 1989 or 90. He was instrumental in the beginnings of the Resurrection Project. And so if I could be a little bit more personal with him, I am. Because when we first met, he and another white guy named Mike Lofton and I, early on in those years, I think what helped us was getting beyond the race issue was have a common goal and a common vision. How do we started doing the right thing to build healthy communities, to put families first and so forth. And I don't think I ever questioned, at least for me, from that community, that Joe was white or this other guy, organizer, was white, because what they were saying made sense to me. What I was saying made sense to him. And so ever since he left Resurrection, as you know, he's been building this incredible organization, IFF, and I believe he's taken that lens to what he's doing this, not just in the city of Chicago, but in other cities as well. So Joe, what is it that you're doing now, because you're working in diverse communities, but you also have to make sure that you have the diverse pool of talent to make you do this work in the different areas that you're expanding to?
So that, what's interesting about that, Raul, and I didn't know that you were going to say that, and of course, thank you, is how I have struggled in that space of being this race-neutral person and realizing that that's part of the problem. So I grew up in Santa Cruz, California. You don't get more progressive than Santa Cruz, California. I went to Grinnell College. You do not get more progressive in Iowa. And then I went to Berkeley to just put the cherry on the cake. And so and now I live in Chicago, right in the blue archipelago of, this country. And it creates a scenario where you get this comfort about being race neutral, and working in Pilsen, and I worked in East Oakland, that begins to make you think that being race neutral is the goal, and then realizing very much how much it's the problem. And
Thank you.
well, I didn't get there easily. I had a staff that kicked my butt when we started this journey last year on creating a new strategic plan for IFF. And we were working on what were going to be the foundational pieces of this new 5-year strategic plan and this new journey for IFF. We're majority women at IFF. We actually have a sizable people of color workforce. So many people would look at us and say, oh, well, you're pretty darn diverse. Like, why are you taking this journey? And again, we get back to, so what? Are we achieving the goals that we want from being diverse? And we're not. So IFF, in its strategic planning process, made a foundational plank of our strategic plan that we were going to create an equity first, diversity, inclusion platform and framework to guide all of the rest of the things that we're going to do. And that is not just about being internal and working on diversity within our workforce, although it certainly includes that. It is about thinking about everything that we do. Our mission is stronger nonprofits and the belief that stronger nonprofits are changing the world. But what world do we want to change to? And how do we support in the practice of strengthening nonprofits, how are we supporting the goals of equity through that? So one really interesting program that we started even before we've got our framework, and I actually left our committee on working on the framework to come here, and then I got to get back, but is in thinking about net worth. And of course, a lot of people are talking about wealth building in communities of color, right? And we don't work with people per se, we work with nonprofits, but there is asset building net worth of nonprofits led by people of color, working in communities of color. What should we do about that? So we challenged the JP Morgan Chase Foundation, who is also focused on this, to say, let's do this about institutions. And then how do we walk back from that? So very much grounding it in the work that IFF does. What is that framework? How does it begin to get us to the place that we want to be so that we have the impact from the goals that we want versus just diversity?
Thank you, Joe. Paul, you mentioned earlier that you, in your personal upbringing and children, you want to focus on not differences, but what do we have in common? And you know, as a white male, I guess I want you to reflect more on this question of this morning. Of what is it that, from your perspective as a white male, we should be focusing on more that addresses this issue of segregation?
Well, that's interesting. That's exactly what I meant when, when I got to race neutral. You know, it took me a while, and I got to the point where I focused in on what we all had in common, and and then I have to use a note here because this is brand new learning for me. I took something called an intercultural developmental inventory as part of an exercise we did at Wintrust out of our new Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And I was like, I am going to nail this test. I'm a great test taker, and I've done everything I'm supposed to do to be where I am today. And I will tell you, I did not nail it. They have this acceptance category, I believe is the term, way over where you want to be, right? And that's where I thought I was going to be, and the test predicted that that's where I thought I was. This test was insidious. And then, but where was I? I was in the middle, what they call minimization, race neutral, right? Same thing. And I'm like, well, no. So, as luck would have it, 2 months later, the executive committee of the Metropolitan Planning Council took the exact same exercise, and I'm on that group. And I'm like, well, fool me once. I'm going to game this test. And I will tell you, I don't know what it is about this thing, but if you put the two charts together from the two different times, they look exactly the same. So, so I went to our head of diversity and inclusion, and I asked her, what can I be doing differently than what I've done in the past? And she mentioned some things, like travel and read books, and I thinking to myself, I travel a lot, and I read a lot of books, including books with stories not exactly like my own. But then I realized, I don't go to Rome or to Boston or to Seattle and say, I'm really looking for what's as close to Chicago as possible here. I'm hoping this is really close. It's an attitude. And I think maybe that's why I'm on this panel. And if you read through the recommendations, I saw a lot on there. A lot of these recommendations are changing hearts and minds. The policies are relatively easy. The political will and changing hearts and minds. And, I thought I was done. I'm not there done. So I'm going to keep working on it.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions from the audience here, and it's really addressed to the entire panel. What will it take to create an independent equity offer or organization that can evaluate and or apply an equity lens that's free of political influence?
Well, there is a group actually working on something similar to that. It's called TRHT, Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. How many in this room have heard of TRHT? Okay, so a good amount. It is an open invitation. It is not an exclusive club. It's over 300 people of organizers and academics and philanthropists, and we need more business people. And as much as I appreciate President Preckwinkle saying she wanted more folks of color in the room, I think it's so important to have white people in these spaces and in these conversations. TRHT is working on a racial equity assessment tool that could be used by different sectors, similar to what is happening in Seattle, so that you have an understanding of your budget, of your policy, and how it impacts communities of color in particular, low-income, immigrant communities, et cetera. But also a racial equity agenda that people can agree on that, I don't know, the word political, I think, is always used to take away from this work. So I don't know if we're going to achieve it getting through the scrim of not being called political, but it will be about how do you give power and agency to communities of color, and that's really what racial equity is about.
You can't take politics out of our existence as humans. I don't know how, I don't think that we can get to a place, we need to change our politics around this, but I don't think you take politics, you can't live outside of politics. That's how I think we view politics as this thing that happens in Washington or thing that happens in Springfield, and of course it does, but all of our discourse when we're working or talking together is political. And so what it's going to take to move us to the place that we want to be, to change politics so that it is about not being race neutral and about, again, achieving the goals that we want from this conversation, means that we have to change politics, but we can't live outside of it.
Paul, Melissa, anything you want to add?
Well, I think in terms of feedback, or in terms of even the political realm, again, we don't have the luxury of exclusivity. We have to ensure that where we're investing our resources, where we're investing our time, is having a positive impact. And, when you think about the square mileage in which we serve, we have rural communities, in Iowa, Wisconsin, we're at Indiana border, and we also have, Chicago region with its urban, areas. So obviously, even the people in Springfield that's making the legislation, we found ways to build coalitions to help drive common causes, and one of the results of that is a recent bill that was passed in December of 2016, the Future Energy Jobs Act, and that is focused on trying to provide opportunities for people who are typically left out of the conversation. So, from that coalition, we were able to help drive that, $30 million worth of investment in workforce development that's kicking off now. So I think from a political perspective, we view it as more of how do you build bridges, how do you build coalitions to, reach the objective that will have a positive impact on the communities that need it the most.
Yeah, I would only add that that to some degree, the political side of things, I work at a bank. we open branches. CIBC is opening a branch here in Bronzeville. At some level, are we that concerned whether that's because of goodwill or because of the Community Reinvestment Act requirements? So the politics, I don't know that it has to be free of politics if the policies are right and guiding action in the right direction.
Okay. We have a few minutes more for questions. So I'm going to take the facility prerogative to open it up for one or two questions from the audience. But before we do that, I want maybe one thing me that's personally interested in, maybe they can comment on. In the video, you saw Cardinal Blaise speaking eloquently. And I was reflecting on that because it was another conversation, that one of the most segregated days of the week, of the year, is every Sunday. Reflect on that. As we think about segregation and integration, how can we also do that on Sundays as well? Questions from the audience? Any questions from the audience? Final thoughts from the panelists? Paul?
The report today just reads like a long list of duties. We've got a lot of work ahead of us.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think the one thing I will add, we were talking about, diversity and inclusion, and, I've been in the business world for decades. I've worked at companies when it was, just diversity, and they did diversity awareness trainings, mandatory, and obviously that has, grown and developed. But there's been something very impactful to me that I've experienced, the way it's been described, that's been helpful, and I'll share it with you. Of course, I'm borrowing it from Aaron Reeves, but when you think about the business imperative of diversity and inclusion, we think about it in terms of newspapers. Are you more informed and in a better position if you have read 5 newspapers, one person reading the same newspaper 5 times? Or is it better if you have 5 different people reading 5 different newspapers? And to me, that means that when you're making business decisions that will impact the communities that you're serving, you want different perspectives around that table. And that is so important to us. As I mentioned, we serve everybody, and everybody's going to digest the services that we're providing. Everybody's going to consume the press releases that we put out. And I would much prefer to be equipped doing that if I have 5 different perspectives that are representing the communities that we're serving at that table.
I guess I'll build on that. And diversity and inclusion is not enough. It is just changing players in a room where the system has been designed to benefit some and not others. It's laborious, and the people who lead diversity and inclusion efforts tend to be people of color who get burnt out, leave those spaces, and then a lot of those efforts go away. What we are talking about today is racial equity, which is not an interchangeable term with diversity and inclusion. It is a revolution. It is rethinking systems, and in the end, it is much more impactful for the goals we all want to achieve.
It's interesting, Raul, because in your introductory remarks, you brought me back to a time when I was 26 years old and just incredibly idealistic, and thinking that the things that we're talking about today, we shouldn't be talking about today. It's heartbreaking. But one thing I want to say is I have my youngest daughter graduated a couple years from Whitney Young, and it was so incredible to come home and see a living room that just looked like what we all want to be. And it made me feel incredibly optimistic. But when I really start to think about that, that's when I was that age, that's what I wanted the world to be too. And this gets back to this equity question. We can't assume that because we have a living room full of the right kids, that we're going to bust through the structural challenges that we have, that then when my daughter's 55, she's having this same stupid conversation. So I'm optimistic, but we have hard work ahead of us.
On my end, just final thoughts. I echo what Joe just mentioned. I think I was sharing to Mary Sue earlier that I'm optimistic for our future, but it's not going to be easy. We all have to be intentional about how do we break down these barriers, how do we create the right opportunities so that we can have our children not talk about this 20, 30 years from now. The optimism I share is that, again, I grew up in Pilsen where I went to a school where not just it was 100% Hispanic, it was 100% Mexican. And I did not know anybody else, right? So my children now are they're growing up in an era where their friends and colleagues are much more than just one race. And so that gives me hope. This generation of today is more tolerant, I believe.
They're more woke.
But we want to make sure that we provide them the right path. I'll conclude with this, and I've been reflecting on this very, very much. You know, I've been part of this neighborhood since I got to this country, and I can honestly see I've seen the bad, the good, the ugly, and now the gray. The good because when I arrived to...
He means this literally.
The good because when I got to Pilsen, it was a changing community from Eastern Europeans to an immigrant Mexican community. I came from Mexico where it was, you know, I remember as a 5-year-old, I think we had 1 bathroom and shared 4 apartments. Coming to Chicago where we lived in a 2-bedroom home, 8 members in the families, but 1 bathroom, right? Much more different than 30 people sharing it. It got bad because resources were not coming in as the new community was changing. It got ugly because gangs and others, again, we had to fight for the school and so forth. And then I've been part of the renaissance of this community that began not just because of us, but through the work of others as well in the 90s, and now it is what it is today. But I say gray because as you as you heard me say in the video, I want to make sure that people who had fought, stayed there, continue to work there, also share in the prosperity that the community is going through instead of being challenged economically to stay there. Thank you all, and thank you to my panelists.
Thank you. Thanks, Raul, and thanks so much to the panelists. My name is Kendra Freeman, and I'm with the Metropolitan Planning Council. And for the past 2 years, I've had the privilege to work with leaders in public health and public safety and equitable transit-oriented development to help forge this path forward to a more equitable region. One of those partners that we've worked really closely with is Elevated Chicago. And that's a collaborative that's working to change the way we do community development in Chicago by leading with racial equity, inclusion, and diversity. MPC is very proud to be one of the founding members of Elevated Chicago. And as a steering committee member, I've been personally challenged just in the ways that I think about power, privilege, and inclusion. So I'd like to introduce Roberto Requejo, the program director for Elevated Chicago.
Thank you, Kendra, and thank you, everyone. I wanted to start thanking MPC for providing us today with the space, not just to talk about this stuff, but also to do collective action and organize collectively about race. And what happens usually in this country is that people are very challenged to talk about race. It's a very hot topic, and people run away from it. But when you tell them that you have to talk about it, and now you have to do something about it, it's even worse. So thank you, Marisa, Mary Sue, Kendra, and the whole team for providing us with this space. And I cannot avoid to talk about one of my receipts, because this has been pretty shaking for me, listening to everybody kind of unveiling. I'm a white man, but I'm also an immigrant. And I was extreme vetted for some time and retained in Spain for some time. After September 11th, it was a pretty bad time. And then tried to find a job in the United States. I come from a relatively poor area, and MPC was the organization that did my work permit. And so I wouldn't be here without you guys. You guys started this racial equity even without knowing it a very long time ago. So So my receipt has been balanced in that front, and I want to thank MPC about that. Enough about me. My organization is Elevated Chicago. And Elevated Chicago was created to change the way we plan and the way we develop neighborhoods, and making racial equity really the first lens and the main lens through which we then plan neighborhoods. Very often, racial equity is an afterthought. We're trying to change those dynamics and frame the planning and development through it. We have started our work around 7 CTA stations here in Chicago that represent the diversity of the city, and we have been very intentional also in making our steering committee, our working groups, our community tables reflective of that diversity, but not only reflecting, but also having the power of all that inclusion and being also able to do investments and grant making representing such diversity. I wanted to ask, because I see a lot of Elevated Chicago members here today, if you are an Elevated Chicago steering committee member or are in a working group or in a community table or are a proxy, you could just raise your hand so people know who you are. Wow. Thank you, everyone. So this group of leaders is already taking on many of the recommendations that are in the roadmap that MPC has provided us today.
Thanks, Roberto. It's really been an amazing morning. Thank you again for joining us. Just a few quick reflections. One of the things that, as I was reflecting back on the panels and the conversation, a couple of things stood out. One, that data is really important. We all know this. A lot of us do research and rely on the data for our jobs. But data is important not only to reveal where the inequities are, but also to hold ourselves accountable. So I thought that was a really good point made in the panels. And having that transparency and shareable data is important so we can build this cross-sector accountability as well. Also, just the need for a culture change. So this is not just about necessarily changing policies, but how do we begin to change culture? Not just through training and education, but also having courageous conversations. I heard the word courage a lot, and the need to talk about race in a different way, and to talk about it in ways, to actually talk about it and have those conversations is important. And also making deliberate investments, not being so conscious of trying to spread the peanut butter so thin. And I think that takes courage too. When you say, like the Cook County president talked about making specific investments in concentrated areas, that takes not just political will, but courage too. So being willing to have the courage to do those things. Roberto?
So you mentioned a lot of my points, but I also have a few other moments that really were impactful. The fact that we're spending $300 million per year in incarcerating people, and of which only 7% have a sentence, that gave me pause on the numbers side of things, but also on the hearts part of things. I want to remind everyone what President Prewinkle said, that it's all in how you frame things. She said that, and really, if we frame things through racial equity, we will arrive to racial equity. If we do not do that, we will end up where we are right now. Commissioner Morita, take care of yourself and each other. That's something that resonated too. This is work that is very emotionally taxing. We need to take care of ourselves. Self-care is important, but also our friends and colleagues around us in this journey. We heard that the most successful regions are the ones that are most equitable, and this is research, and sometimes it's hard to make the business case, but we do have it. We have the information, and we have to just socialize it with leaders. Melissa mentioned that one of her challenges was having to prove constantly that you belong, right, as an African-American woman. So everyone here that has felt that constant need to prove yourself and do 2 and 3 times the work in order to demonstrate, that's something to consider when you think about all the preparation, and if you are in the side of privilege, all the care that you need to provide to those who are experiencing that lack of belongingness many times in meeting rooms, in boardrooms, in churches, wherever you are, that one person at the table. Angelique mentioned that we need glasses to look into racial equity with that lens. I do want to challenge the use of the term race neutral, because I think it kind of implies that when we don't include race, the results are going to be neutral, and that is just not true, right? I think what we need to start talking about is race blindness in many cases and color blindness in our policies. And then some of the reflections also during the day for me were along this concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion, that they can be values that guide our visions and our companies, and that's inspirational and great. But I like to see them also as skills and muscles that you have to train. And if we do that, then we can think about this morning as a workout that we have done in racial equity. So I want to go down the path of this metaphor for a minute, because I think it kind of relates to the work that we do. And so first of all, what MPC has given us, if we think this was a workout, was not only a great workout, but also a great program for the rest of the year, and for some of us for the rest of our lives, in trying to advance many of those recommendations. So we have that from them. But for those of you who train or go to the gym, you also know that very important is to have gym buddies around you all the time. And what MPC has provided us today too is a room of gym buddies that are going to be there across this journey, because this journey sometimes feels very lonely, right? And just like with workouts, you think, where are my results? I've been at this for 6 months. I'm still in size 34. This is actual truth right now. But it gets to that point where you're wondering, how long is this going to take, right? So having your gym buddies around you and having that support group is very important and meaningful. So we just spent some time this morning working out at the Racial Equity Gym that MPC has provided us. Feels good, feels inspiring, feels hopeful and galvanizing. But we want to challenge you all, because I look around the room and you don't look like the types that go to the gym on January 2nd, do the workout, and then go home and expect results. I think this is a room of folks that know that in order to make change, this has to be a constant, consistent training, and a constant and consistent, sometimes pain, right? You know the workout is working when it hurts a little bit. And for sure, personally, some of the things that were shared here today hurt to hear, and that means that this is starting to work, at least for myself. So we want to challenge you all to continue the workout, and I'm going to let Kendra close.
Thanks, Roberto. Great metaphor. So I'm going to ask you to take a minute and just reflect on 2 questions, keeping with the workout theme. The first question is, what is your personal workout plan? So take a minute and think about what's your personal workout plan that you want to start instituting. And the second is, how can you begin to flex your racial equity muscles within your workplace and your organizations where you are? So on your seat in your packet, you should have a little green card that looks like this. We had some great sharing from our speakers today. A lot of them shared from their personal experiences, not just their educational experience and professional experiences. So we're going to ask you to also share with us before you leave. So if you can take a moment, take a pen out, and think about those 2 questions, and just share a few thoughts about what your personal plan will be, plan for your personal workout, and how you want to flex your racial equity muscles at your workplace. And just jot that down. And you can add your name and your email if you would like us to follow up with you as we continue on this journey together, or you could just make it anonymous. But we're very interested in really understanding and documenting the power and the attention set here today. So we'd love to have you do that. And there's some baskets in the back, and staff can take these before you leave. So as we wrap up, I think one of the questions is, what's next? What's the next step? And I personally believe that answer lies with all of us here in this room, and not just those people in this room, but also everyone in the Chicago region. And how we move forward on this roadmap that we got today, how do we move this roadmap into not just a map, but how do we move it into action? And that lies with the commitments that we make today. And we really hope, as we continue this work, as MPC is on this journey, we look forward to seeing you And we look forward to continuing to work with you as we take this journey towards a more equitable region in Chicago. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to thank our speakers and our sponsors once again. Don't forget to leave your cards in the basket. Don't forget, you can also go to our website, which is metroplanning.org /roadmap to get more details about the roadmap. I'd like to also thank a special thank you to our inaugural funders, Chicago Community Trust and the MacArthur Foundation, for the support that you've given us over the 2.5, 3 years. Thank you so much. And thank you again to CIBC for their support in the video. And one more thing I'd like to call to your attention. Thank you so much to Francis and Andre, I'm not sure where they are, for hosting us in your wonderful space today. So we were fortunate enough to have this wonderful exhibit, but there's another one coming up. So there should be some postcards in the back as well, where you can see the next exhibit here at Gallery Gouchard on individualism. Please come back to Bronzeville. Come back and share your experiences at Gallery Gouchard. And please continue this conversation. We have some hashtags that you can tweet about, share on Instagram and Twitter or whatever. But we just want you to continue to share this conversation. So thanks again for your time. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.